When people read Genesis, they often assume it's answering the same kinds of questions modern science asks. Questions about material, mechanisms, and timelines. But what if Genesis is answering a different kind of question altogether? Today I want to explore a distinction that helps explain why faithful Christians can read the same text, affirm the same God, and still disagree on how creation unfolded. That distinction is between material origins and functional order. That's what we're going to explore today. Welcome to ThinkJesus Ministries, Faith and the Cosmos, Episode 6. Faith and the Cosmos is a teaching and discussion series exploring Christian theology, biblical interpretation, and modern science through the lens of dual revelation, the belief that God reveals truth through both Scripture and creation. Hi, my name is Jacob Jackson, and this is a new episode in our series, Faith and the Cosmos, from ThinkJesus Ministries. We're continuing our series by looking at Genesis 1 and 2 and whether they are explaining material origins or functional order and purpose. Why does this matter? This distinction matters because it shapes how we approach both Scripture and science. If we expect Genesis to answer questions it was never written to address, we can end up forcing the text into modern categories or dismissing it when it doesn't meet those expectations. But if we learn to ask the right questions of the text, Genesis begins to speak with remarkable clarity. When we talk about material origins, we're asking questions like these. What is something made of? How did it physically come into existence? What processes produced it? And how long did that process take? These are the kinds of questions asked by physics, chemistry, biology, and geology. They are good questions. They are necessary questions, but they are modern scientific questions. Functional order asks a different set of questions. What role does this serve? What purpose does it fulfill? How does it fit into an ordered whole? These are the kinds of questions ancient people asked about the world. In the ancient Near Eastern context, to say something exists often meant that it had been assigned a function, a role, within an ordered system. Function answers the question, what is this for? Versus material origins asking the question, what is this made of? Here's a simple way to think about it. Imagine walking into a fully equipped kitchen. You could ask material questions. What kind of wood are the cabinets made of? What kind of metal is the stove constructed from? Or you could ask functional questions. Where is the food prepared? Where is it cooked? Where do people gather to eat? Who designed and laid out the kitchen? Both sets of questions are valid, but they're not the same question. Genesis often reads like a text explaining how God ordered the kitchen, not a blueprint describing how every component was manufactured. When we look closely at Genesis 1, we notice that God's actions are described again and again in functional terms. God separates light from darkness. God names day and night. God assigns the lights to govern time. God fills realms with creatures. God blesses and commissions life. These are not descriptions of physical mechanisms. They are descriptions of order, role, and purpose. Genesis presents creation as God bringing structure and meaning into a world, not as a step-by-step account of material assembly. One of the clearest ways we can see what Genesis is emphasizing is by paying attention to the Hebrew verbs the text actually uses. For example, bara, create. The most well-known creation verb in Genesis is bara. Bara is used exclusively with God as the subject. Humans never bara anything. But bara does not describe a physical process. It doesn't tell us how something is made. It tells us who is responsible. When Genesis says God bara, it is declaring divine agency, not describing mechanics. Another is asah, make or do. Another common verb, usually translated make. Asah is flexible. It can mean to do, accomplish, fashion, or carry out. It usually means something is being created from existing materials, like baking a cake with flour, eggs, milk, sugar, etc. Asah emphasizes activity and purpose, but not material composition. Another is amar and hayah. God said, "Let there be." One of the most striking features of Genesis 1 is how often it says, "And God said." The verb amar, to speak, appears again and again. When God says, "Let there be light," the Hebrew is simply, "Light be." From the verb hayah, meaning to be or become. This language emphasizes becoming, not manufacturing. Reality responds immediately to God's command. Creation unfolds through divine speech, authority, attention, and order. Another is natan, set or appoint. When Genesis describes the sun and the moon, it uses a different verb. It says God natans. He sets them in the sky. Natan means to assign or appoint. The text doesn't describe how the sun or moon are physically constructed. It describes what they are for, to govern time, day, and night. Finally, qara, name. Another repeated action is naming. When God qaras, he names the light, day, and the darkness, night. In the ancient world, meaning is an act of authority. To name something is to define its role within an ordered system. When we move to Genesis 2, the language shifts. Here, God is said to yatsar, or yatsar, like a TS sound, form the human from the dust of the ground. Yatsar is the verb used of a potter shaping clay. It emphasizes care, intention, and intimacy. But even here, the text does not describe a physical process or timeline. It highlights personal involvement, not mechanics. Genesis 2 uses yatsar because it's focused on relationship and vocation, not cosmology. When we put all this together, a pattern emerges. Genesis emphasizes God creating, bara, God making, asah, God speaking, amar, God bringing reality into ordered being, hayah, God assigning roles, natan, God defining identity, qara, and God personally forming humanity, yatsar. What emphasis Genesis does not emphasize is detailed description of physical mechanisms. The Hebrew language of Genesis consistently points us toward authority, purpose, and order, rather than material assembly instructions. What this does not mean that the physical world isn't real. It does not mean God didn't create matter and energy, and it does not mean science is irrelevant. What it does mean is that Genesis is doing theological work first. What kind of world this is, what kind of God stands behind it. Science, on the other hand, describes how that world behaves. Once we regard and recognize this distinction, something important becomes clear. Genesis leaves room for questions about material origins, questions that the text does not answer explicitly. That's why different creation models emerge among Christians. This is not a disagreement about whether God created. It's about how biblical interpretation and scientific description relate. Coming up soon, in the coming episodes, we'll explore how faithful Christians integrate Genesis with scientific data in different ways. We'll look at where Scripture is clear, where it allows flexibility, and why disagreement doesn't have to threaten faith. My hope is that this distinction between material origins and functional order helps you read Genesis more carefully and engage science more thoughtfully. Next time, we'll explore what Genesis requires theologically before we ever talk about models, timelines, or mechanisms. Now, I know some of you are already holding on to one model or another, and you can't wait for me to get to the nitty-gritty details. Let me assure you, we are almost there. We're almost there. The first chunk of episodes will be pre-recorded. Yes, I know, I said chunk, not few. Later episodes will be live-streamed on YouTube with an opportunity to engage through chat. If you're willing to walk this journey with me, whether you agree with every conclusion or not, you're welcome here. My prayer is not that you leave this series with all the answers, but that you leave it with a deeper reverence for God, a stronger confidence in Scripture, and a renewed sense of wonder at His creation. Thanks for joining me for Think Jesus, Faith in the Cosmos. I'll see you next time.